The clash of swords has ended, the trumpets have gone silent, and the Roman legion stands victorious, but at a terrible cost. The battlefield is littered with the dead and the dying. Among them lies Marcus, a veteran legionary, bleeding heavily from a deep gash to his thigh and a shattered shield arm. This is the moment history books rarely dwell on. We hear about the glory of Roman victories, the triumphal marches, and the emperors who claimed the spoils. But what about the ordinary soldier who paid for that victory with his blood? What happened when a Roman soldier was too badly wounded to stand? Was he abandoned among the corpses, carried back by his comrades, or given a fighting chance at survival by Rome's primitive but surprisingly advanced military medicine? To answer this, we need to walk step by step through the grim aftermath of battle, because the fate of men like Marcus tells us far more about Rome's empire than any marble monument ever could. Marcus isn't alone. Around him, the battlefield hums with a grim second act. Victorious legionaries move through the carnage, calling out for comrades, listening for faint cries. They strip weapons from the fallen enemy, but they also search for their own. A severely wounded soldier could not simply be left behind, at least not if he still had a chance. Roman camaraderie ran deep, forged by years of marching, drilling, and bleeding together. Two soldiers might grab Marcus under the arms, while another takes his legs. If they have time, they'll improvise a stretcher by laying him across two shields locked side by side. This was no gentle process. Every jolt sent fire through his shattered arm and torn leg. But time mattered more than comfort. The quicker he could be hauled from the killing ground, the higher his chances of living to see another sunrise. The Roman army, unlike many of its ancient rivals, treated battlefield evacuation as part of its discipline. Soldiers weren't trained only to fight. They were trained to protect one another, to drag a comrade out even under missile fire. And so Marcus, slipping in and out of consciousness, would find himself lifted, carried, and shuffled back toward the distant outline of the marching camp. Behind him, others less lucky bled quietly into the soil, their final moments unmarked. Rome was practical. Save who can be saved, mourn later. Crossing the boundaries of the Roman camp was like stepping into another world. Outside lay chaos, bodies, and the reek of death. Inside stood order, tents lined in straight rows, ditches dug in perfect symmetry, sentries posted with calm precision. Marcus's rescuers would carry him not to the barracks, but to the section reserved for the wounded, a space that could transform into a makeshift hospital within hours. Later in Rome's history, this idea became formalized into the valetudinarium, permanent military hospitals attached to forts. But even in the Republic and early Empire, commanders knew the value of setting aside tents for care. Here waited the medici, Rome's military doctors. Some were trained through apprenticeships, others were Greek physicians captured or hired by the legions, men who had studied Hippocrates and Galen. They were not miracle workers, but by ancient standards, their skill was remarkable. Marcus would be laid on a rough wooden board. Assistants would cut away his armor, slice off his blood-soaked tunic, and expose the wounds. The medicus's eyes scanned quickly. How deep? How dangerous? How much time left? In that instant, Marcus's fate balanced between survival and death, not because Rome lacked compassion, but because resources were finite. A soldier deemed hopeless might be left to die quietly, given wine to ease his final hours. But Marcus still breathed strong. His heart still pounded. That was enough to earn him the medicus's full attention. Now begins the part most modern viewers would find shocking. Roman military medicine was not crude guesswork. The medicus had a chest of tools that would look at home in a surgeon's kit today. Bronze scalpels of various shapes, hooks for extracting barbed arrowheads, forceps for pulling bone fragments, needles for stitching wounds closed with linen thread, even cautery irons, heated in the fire until red-hot, used to sear vessels and stop deadly bleeding. Marcus's leg wound came first, a long gash deep enough to sever muscle, maybe even touch bone. Assistants poured vinegar over it, believing it to cleanse infection. The soldier screamed, half biting through the leather straps shoved between his teeth. Wine followed, not just to dull pain, but to wash away clotted blood. The medicus then pressed cloth to slow the bleeding before probing with steady hands. If a foreign object was lodged inside, a spearhead fragment, a piece of shattered armor, it had to be removed no matter how much agony it caused. His arm wound, swollen and bent unnaturally, hinted at a fracture. Splints would be applied after repositioning the bone, a process requiring brutal force. No anesthetic, no morphine, only discipline, willpower, and comrades holding him down as bones cracked back into place. For burns, gashes, or amputations, the cautery iron was brought forward, sizzling as it touched flesh. To a modern audience, it seems barbaric, but compared to leaving a man to bleed out or rot with infection, it was advanced. Marcus endured this not as a victim, but as a soldier of Rome knowing the price of survival. If he lived through tonight, his real battle against fever and infection was still ahead. In the Roman camp, survival wasn't guaranteed by courage alone. Cold, pragmatic choices often determined who lived and who didn't. The medicus was not a healer in the modern sense. He was a battlefield strategist of flesh and bone. He knew which wounds could be managed and which spelled inevitable death. A clean cut, even if deep, might heal with time and stitches. A spear through the chest, an arrow buried in the gut, those were considered hopeless. Why waste precious manpower and bandages when others had a chance? Marcus, with his mangled leg and broken arm, was bad, but not hopeless. His lungs were clear, he was conscious, and his heart was strong. That tipped the scales in his favor. Another man on the next cot, pierced through the belly, might be offered only a strong draught of wine to dull the agony before the end. The Romans weren't heartless. They were ruthlessly practical. A soldier wasn't just a man. He was state property, an investment of training and pay. Those who could still be patched up were worth the effort. Those who couldn't became another name whispered during burial rites. For Marcus, every gasp, every groan, and every twitch was a signal that he still belonged to the living, and the medicus would fight to keep him there. Treatment began with the leg, the most urgent danger. Assistants poured more vinegar over the gash, scrubbing the wound with sponges that had to be reused again and again, a silent risk of infection no one yet understood. The medicus probed until he was sure no iron fragments remained. Then came the stitching. Using curved bronze needles, he pulled linen thread through Marcus's torn flesh. Each tug drew a howl. Once closed, the wound was covered with poultices of honey or resin, substances known even then for their antibacterial qualities. Next was the arm. The medicus ordered 2 strong men to hold Marcus steady. With a practiced jerk, he wrenched the broken bone back into alignment. Marcus screamed, sweat streaming down his face until he collapsed into unconsciousness. The arm was bound with splints of wood and strips of cloth. Other soldiers around him endured their own tortures. Arrows dug from ribs, javelin points pried from thighs, burns cauterized by red-hot irons. Each operation was a gamble. The techniques were advanced for their time, but without anesthesia or antiseptics, survival came down to the soldier's constitution and sheer luck. For Marcus, the battlefield was behind him, but the true trial of endurance had just begun inside the medicus's tent. There was no relief, no morphine to send Marcus into oblivion. Roman medicine relied on whatever nature provided. Wine was the most common painkiller, poured not only into wounds, but down the throat, numbing body and spirit. Sometimes opium or mandrake root was available, but these were rare luxuries. More often, the soldier simply had to endure. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, waking to flashes of fire as the cautery iron seared vessels shut, or the vinegar stung like acid. Groans echoed around him. The tent was filled with men battling both wounds and fear. Discipline had trained them to face death on the battlefield, but this, lying helpless, chained to agony, was a different enemy. Survival wasn't only about the body. A soldier's mind had to endure the hours and days of torment without surrendering to despair. Rome admired stoicism. A man who bore pain silently was praised, remembered. Those who wailed too loudly might be mocked as weak. Marcus clenched his teeth, muttering prayers to Mars and Jupiter, trying to anchor himself against the tide of agony. Pain, for a Roman soldier, was not just suffering, it was the ultimate test of loyalty to Rome. If Marcus made it through the first night, his fight shifted into a slower, more uncertain war, the battle against infection. In the days that followed, his wounds would be cleaned repeatedly with vinegar and wrapped with fresh bandages. Poultices of honey or crushed herbs might be applied, each intended to draw out corruption. Still, fever often set in, a silent killer the medici could not always understand. Soldiers watched each other anxiously. Those who burned with fever often died within a week. Others, miraculously, recovered. Marcus spent his days lying on a cot, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, listening to the groans of men around him. Assistants carried water and food, usually simple porridge or bread softened in broth, trying to keep the patients nourished. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and vinegar. Each sunrise brought hope. Each nightfall brought the dread of death stealing silently through the rows of wounded. Slowly, if fortune was kind, Marcus's fever broke. The wound on his leg began to knit. The arm, stiff in its splint, itched maddeningly but held straight. For a Roman soldier, healing wasn't a matter of comfort, but survival. Every day lived was another victory. But even survival carried its own burdens. For a man who had spent years defined by strength, endurance, and discipline, the helplessness of recovery was crushing. Marcus, once a hardened veteran, now depended on others to feed him, change his bandages, even help him sit upright. Around him, comrades either recovered or slipped into silence forever. The camaraderie of the legion was both comfort and torment. He wasn't alone, yet he was forced to witness others suffering. The mind of a Roman soldier was trained for battle, not for idleness. Some became restless, bitter, even ashamed of their weakness. For Marcus, the fear of permanent injury haunted every waking hour. Would he march again in the proud ranks of the legion, shield and gladius in hand? Or would he be cast aside, deemed unfit, sent home crippled? In the Roman world, honor and identity were bound to military service. To lose that was to lose everything. Recovery wasn't just about bones and flesh. It was about dignity, manhood, and belonging. Every step toward healing was more than just a physical act. It was a fight to reclaim his place in the only world he knew, the army of Rome. The story of Marcus, whether he limped back into formation, lived out his days on a pension, or perished quietly in the medicus's tent, reminds us of a truth often lost in Rome's marble monuments and epic histories. The empire was not built only on the brilliance of generals or the ambition of emperors. It was built on flesh, on the battered bodies of men who marched thousands of miles, who bled on foreign soil, and who placed their trust in comrades to carry them off the field when they could no longer stand. Rome's military medicine, advanced though it was for its time, could not erase the horror of wounds or the gamble of infection.
For every soldier who recovered, countless others succumbed in silence, far from home. Yet the very existence of medici, of organized care, shows us that Rome understood something vital. The legionary was more than a weapon. He was an asset worth preserving, a brother in arms whose survival meant the survival of the legion itself. And so when we ask what happened to a severely wounded Roman soldier after battle, the answer is layered. Some endured the knife, the fire, and the fever to return to duty. Some were discharged, living reminders of the empire's endless wars. Others died quietly, their names forgotten, but their sacrifice woven into Rome's victories. The empire's greatness rested not only in triumphal processions or imperial decrees, but in the resilience of soldiers like Marcus, men whose greatest battle often began after the fighting ended. Their story is the hidden cost of conquest, the part history books rarely tell, but without which Rome could never have endured.